Coda. Amateur archaeology in Iraq. During all this, I never quite lost the surreal sense that I had become in some way a pro-government dissident, and that of all the paradoxes of my little life, this might have to register as the most acute one. But it was the demonstrators in the streets — I was teaching at Berkeley for much of the first spring of the Iraq War — who struck me as the real conformists of the scenario. Accused of becoming a sellout by working for the interwar Yugoslav Republic, Rebecca West's guide and covert lover, Constantine, in Black Lamb, Grey Falcon, confesses that, yes, for the sake of my country, and perhaps a little for the sake of my soul, I have given up the deep peace of being in opposition. I too began to find that I could see things from the point of view of the governors, and that I was on the side of those now striving to build up a new state in Afghanistan and Iraq. In any case, the opponents of the war were themselves aligned with the views of other governors and states, many of them much more smelly than George W. Bush. I still cannot bear to imagine the idea of a victory for Putin and Chirac and Annan and Schroeder, let alone the Chinese or the Saudis. But in the event, the glad moment came when Saddam Hussein outdid himself and refused to save his evil system, even by making the small concession of admitting and proving to the UN that he didn't currently possess any workable WMDs. I crossed the Kuwaiti border into Iraq not long after the first wave had gone racing up toward Baghdad, and saw a little of the barbaric state to which southern Iraqi society had been reduced by a combination of Saddamism and the sanctions that it had necessitated. In Kuwait City, I had watched Saddam Hussein's Scud missiles being shot out of the sky as they were fired randomly toward his now liberated former colony, and smiled as I saw all the members of the press corps donning gas masks and running to the shelters to avoid the shower of chemical weapons, gases, and nerve agents which never turned up, and in which they later claimed never to have believed. I can say for myself that I didn't bring or wear or own a gas mask, or believe that any element of Saddam's armed forces, except the imported and jihad-minded Fedahin Saddam, a suggestive name in its own right, would do any real fighting. As I left Kuwait, the European press was awash in ridiculous babbling about a last-ditch defense of Baghdad that would be the equivalent of Stalingrad. And that was just the hacks. A few days later came a more considered piece by the cultivated Jonathan Rabin, deploying, almost faultlessly, the wrinkled lip across which he and his fellow members of the Anglo-American bien-pensant classes viewed the deplorable crudity of the US of A. Passionate ideologues, he wrote, are incurious by nature and have no time for obstructive details. It's impossible to think of Paul Wolfowitz curling up for the evening with Edward Said's Orientalism, or the novels of Najib Mahfouz, or the Seven Pillars of Wisdom, or the Letters of Gertrude Bell, or the recently published knotty, opaque but useful book by Lawrence Rosen, The Culture of Islam, based on Rosen's anthropological work. Made perhaps unintentionally absurd by that use of the expression curled up to depict the act of reading. "You'll usually find me," said Bertie Wooster to Florence Cray and Thank You Jeeves, "curled up with Spinoza's latest." Rabin's guardian of fusion became ever more vulnerable to ridicule as he began to discourse knowingly on the body of the Islamic Ummah, or community, as if it were a passive female form capable of violation, for all the world as if Saddam Hussein had never invaded and tried to amputate and subjugate the two Muslim states of Iran and Kuwait, besides repeatedly raping and torturing and disfiguring his own captive nation. In point of fact, Paul Wolfowitz wrote his doctoral dissertation on water and salinity in the Arab world, has lived for many years with an Arab woman scholar with close connections to Palestinian reformers, speaks more Arabic than Jonathan Rabin, was married previously to an anthropologist with a special interest in the Muslim societies of Malaysia and Indonesia, was himself a diplomat in Jakarta and speaks some of the Bahasa language too, and once telephoned me to disagree with a detail in something I had written about the Indonesian novelist Pramoedya Anantatur. Wolfowitz was for many years the dean of a major school of Johns Hopkins University, and is thanked by name in the acknowledgments of Azan Nafizi's brave, beautiful book, Reading Lolita in Tehran, a study of the relations between literature, sexuality, and power under Muslim theocracy that can stand comparison to anything written by Edward Said or even Najib Mahfouz. If anyone was being colonial or Orientalist here, it was Jonathan Rabin, a most refined Englishman who didn't believe that a mere Yank could know anything about the exotic latitudes where only travel writers like himself were authorized to tread. But his tone of infuriated condescension was vastly preferable to the way in which the BBC's on-air bookers and interviewers, telephoning me as if to make sure they couldn't be accused of undue bias, would flatly and simply decline to pronounce Paul Wolfowitz's name correctly. Wolfowitz, they would say, putting a sinister top spin on it. I remember a time in the 1970s when a certain Colonel X of the old Le Carré school would sit in a discreet office at the BBC, occasionally asking programme producers if they intended to make regular use of this chap Hitchens, fascinating as he no doubt can be. But at least in those days of nudge and wink political invigilation, it was considered minimal good manners to get someone's name right. How hard could it be, I would inquire icily, and sometimes after the BBC caller had begun by addressing me as Chris, to pronounce the name phonetically or as it was spelled? "All right," one of them said grudgingly. "This fellow Wolfowitz, who seems to be the power behind the scenes with his neocon cabal," I made the man stop and begin all over again. I prefer to think that I'm not unusually thin-skinned when it comes to clumsy innuendos on the Jewish question. But this sort of stuff was a complete giveaway, and I do think that one must never just sit there when it's being vented. As an undergraduate at Oxford, I was once asked by a friendly Don at All Souls if I would help him arrange a gentle punting trip for Sir Max Mallowan, also a fellow of the college, by then rather elderly, and Lady Mallowan. I agreed readily, and not just because Lady Mallowan was better known as Agatha Christie. Sir Max had been the doyen of the British archaeological expedition in Mesopotamia between the wars, and could be mentioned in the same breath as Gertrude Bell when it came to the treasure house that was the Iraqi National Museum. The afternoon drifted by agreeably enough, and I must have passed muster in some way, because I was then invited to dine at the Mallowan home in nearby Wallingford. Around their table, in a house festooned with Middle Eastern miniatures and statuettes, I very suddenly felt myself congealing with unease. The anti-Jewish flavour of the talk was not to be ignored or overlooked, or put down to heavy humour or generational prejudice. It was vividly unpleasant, and it was bottom-numbingly boring. I had the excuse, if I can call it that, of not having read any of the Agatha Christie effusion. I have checked it since, and been surprised by many things about it, most of all its popularity. How right Raymond Chandler was to scorn her trudgery. There must be some connection between the general nullity of Christie's prose and the tendency of her detectives to take Jewishness as a symptom of crime. After 1945 she learned to hold down the bigotry a bit, but one of the 1950s efforts, titled They Came to Baghdad, is all about a well-funded and Iraq-based plot for a new world order, featuring clammy Jewish employers and a deeply sinister scheme called the Wolfenson Merger. When I went back to Iraq again after the liberation was complete, I was myself engaged on a sort of dig, and I decided to travel with Paul Wolfowitz. It was, in its own way, an archaeological and anthropological expedition. Here are some of the things we unearthed or observed. Unnoticed by almost everybody, and unreported by most newspapers, Saddam Hussein's former chief physicist, Dr. Mahdi Obeidi, had waited until a few weeks after the fall of Baghdad to accost some American soldiers and invite them to excavate his back garden. There he showed them the components of a gas centrifuge, the crown jewels of uranium enrichment, along with a 2-foot stack of blueprints. This burial had originally been ordered by Saddam's youngest son, Qusay, who had himself been in charge of the Ministry of Concealment, and had outlasted many visits by inspectors. I myself rather doubt that Hans Blix would ever have found the trove on his own. Not long after that, a sandstorm near Baghdad uncovered a bizarre row of shimmering airplane tail fins. These proved to be the grave markers of a squadron of expensive Russian-built MiG-25 jet fighters. The point of the burial was and still remains unclear. One might as well set a jet engine on fire as immerse it in a dune. But the instinct for hugger-mugger interment among the eerie upper echelons of the Ba'ath Party seems to have been strongly ingrained. Iraq is almost the size of California. I dare say that they buried other military secrets that we will never know about. Near the northern town of Kirkuk, in the June that followed the invasion, a total of $8 million in cash was dug out of the garden of Saddam Hussein's personal secretary. Along with this came a further few $1 million worth of jewellery belonging to Saddam Hussein's wife. In the end, Saddam Hussein himself was pulled, in an undignified manner, from an underground hole where he had taken ignominious refuge. But the worst of all the unearthings and diggings and disinterments took place not far from the ruins of Babylon, in the town of Al-Hila. On the 13th of May 2003, not long after the liberation, frenzied local people had begged American forces to come and help, and also to bear witness. Ever since 1991 and the massive repression of the Shia uprising, the site had had an evil and disgusting reputation. It was said by witnesses that 3 truckloads of people, 3 times a day for a month, had been driven here. Forced into pre-dug mass graves, they were then either shot or buried alive. Seizing the chance to identify their missing loved ones, local people had swarmed to the place as soon as Saddam Hussein's regime disintegrated, and uncovered 3,000 bodies with their bare hands before calling for help from the coalition. By the time I got there, the excavation process was becoming more dignified and orderly, but nothing could render it less obscene. Lines of plastic body bags were laid out on the ground, sometimes tagged with personal items and identifying documents. Where digging was complete, the ground had been consecrated as a resting place. Elsewhere, the ghastly spade work continued. The 2 men in charge of the scene were a Major Schmidt from New Jersey and Dr. Rafed Fakir Hussein, a strikingly composed Iraqi physician. "We live without rights," he told me, with a gesture of his hand towards this area of darkness, "and without ideas." The second sentence seemed to hang in the noisome air for longer than the first, and to express the desolation more completely. There were 62 more such sites, I was to learn, in this province of southern Iraq alone. It was mid-July, when the Mesopotamian heat can without effort bring off the achievement of 120 degrees. This means the constant smearing of oneself with sunscreen and the exuding of drenching perspiration. The hair becomes matted and damp, the clothes cling, and then the wind gets up. I suddenly realized that a paste was forming all over me, made up of various greases and slimes, natural and artificial, and thickly overlaid by a crust from the clinging filth of a mass grave. I hoped never again to feel so utterly befouled. It was in the nostrils, in the eyes, on the tongue and in the mouth, and the chance of a wash, let alone of a cleansing shower, was a good way off. I was eventually able to have that shower, almost weeping with mingled disgust and relief, in the Al-Rashid Hotel in Baghdad, but the rest of Iraqi society was still digging itself out of a shallow grave, and those who fetishized the ideal of death and the grave, Ba'athist and Islamist, were getting ready to blast further hecatombs all across the landscape. "Scum of the earth," I wrote in my notebook, meaning by this cliché the Saddamist Al-Qaeda alliance and not the gritty residue that had been my nauseating carapace. After that, not even the abattoir stench from the execution sheds in newly liberated Abu Ghraib could shake me as much. I do remember thinking that attempts to clean out and restart that horror prison were doomed, and that it should simply have been demolished, with salt strewn over the ruins. I wish that I'd made that point more forcibly too. It impressed me very much to see my Kurdish friends, including Iraq's first-ever democratically chosen president, Jalal Talabani, publicly voice their opposition to the death penalty for Saddam Hussein and the other convicted war criminals. This appeal to clemency arose partly from their adherence to the Socialist International and also from their wish to begin Iraq again without a blood reckoning. After what they had endured, their forbearance was something extraordinary. In Kurdistan itself, where tribal retributionism was not so much in evidence, Bahram Salih personally declined to sign death warrants for the Islamist gangsters who had murdered his guards and very nearly slain him on his own doorstep. Also unearthed, but this time in paper form and in the state archives, were documents showing that a surprising number of anti-war politicians in several countries were the beneficiaries of oil-for-food kickbacks. In other words, of money stolen directly from the suffering Iraqi people about whom they orated. There was also a letter from my old friend Naji Sabri al-Hadithi, who'd ended up as Saddam Hussein's last foreign minister. It was addressed to Saddam himself in the closing moments of the regime, and it expressed concern of a sort that I believe is worth recording. "It was distressing," wrote Naji, "to see the reports of Iraqi civilians rushing forward to greet advancing American and British soldiers. Such deplorable events were discrediting the heroic Saddamist struggle in the wider world. Might it not be advisable," he suggested to his leader, "to send some of the suicide martyrs of the Fedayeen Saddam, disguised as civilians, to detonate themselves as soon as they drew close enough to the new arrivals? That would soon enough teach the British and Americans to suspect all Iraqis as terrorists and to keep their distance." This document was originally published by my old friend Patrick Coburn, perhaps the best chronicler of the war, and certainly its most fervent and intelligent critic. There was something horribly simple about this idea, and I wondered for a while why a foreign minister should even be suggesting such a vile thing. Later reports, to the effect that Naji had been shopping on the other side of the street and providing secret information to the coalition via back channels, at least supplied a likely motive. In Saddam's Iraq, if you wanted to cover yourself, the best thing was to propose the most exorbitantly cruel and extreme measures. Poor old Naji, then, to be reduced to this wicked expedient. Anyway, Naji's scheme was indeed adopted, as were some other measures. A woman in the town of Nasiriyah was publicly hanged for welcoming the liberators. We have video footage of other Iraqis having their tongues cut out or their extremities lopped off for the same offence, by the sort of black-cowled holy warriors who've become so drearily familiar to us since. It matters to me to remember this saturnalia of butchery because of third-hand observers who like to mock the idea that Iraqis ever saluted their liberators with sweets and flowers, or whatever the sneer happens to be. I cannot exactly vouch for the kinds of sweets or the sorts of flowers, but in Iraq I saw some quite extraordinary things, and I will not be made to deny the evidence of my own eyes. Along the road from Basra one day in the summer of 2003, travelling all the way to the holy Shiite cities of Najaf and Karbala, I sat in a very lightly armed American convoy of civilian cars and saw people run to the roadside with no advance notice of our arrival. I know this because I know we hadn't planned in advance to take that road, and simply wave and smile and show signs of happiness. It was completely unlike anything stage-managed, which in the Iraq of Saddam had involved great orchestrated ululations and contortions and mad avowals of the willingness for blood sacrifice. It was normal and proportional, and in its way rather beautiful, and I give the lie to those who say I did not see those crowds or clasp those hands. Landing by chopper on another occasion in the marshes, I did see a less spontaneous, they knew we were coming, and more hysterical greeting, but the marsh Arabs were hardly likely to react any other way, having had their ancient riparian habitat once destroyed by Saddam and now reflooded by the Americans. In those amazing reed palaces that could by a stretch have dated back to the mythical Abraham, the enthusiasm and hospitality might have been prepared but could not possibly have been feigned. As for Kurdistan, I'd already seen this land when it was Saddam's people who had the mastery of it. Here one met an even more respectful joy in a territory which did not any longer require or ask for a single Western soldier. Here we were the guests in a different sense, because the people of northern Iraq already had secure stewardship of their own affairs, and were firmly but politely outgrowing their former protectors. To witness this was wholly, profoundly satisfactory. I am sorry for those who have never had the experience of seeing the victory of a national liberation movement, and I feel cold contempt for those who jeer at it. Naji Sabri's horrible suggestion that such enthusiasm be quelled in such a way, he had the grace to look abashed when I next saw him in exile in Qatar, of course makes the additional implicit point that the Ba'athist leadership knew and took for granted that it had suicide squads at its disposal. This in turn suggests a long and official collusion between the Saddam regime and the religious zealots. Abu Nidal had become by this time quite old hat. He was actually murdered by Saddam's police just as the Allies were surrounding Baghdad airport, lest he disclose anything inconvenient. Captured by the coalition while still under Iraqi protection was Abu Abbas, leader of the gang that had rolled Leon Klinghoffer in his wheelchair from the deck of the Achille Lauro cruise ship. He had had to be released after his arrest in that episode because he was travelling on a diplomatic passport, an Iraqi diplomatic passport. Now, belatedly, he was under lock and key. Still not yet apprehended is Mr. Mehmet Yassin, the man who mixed the chemicals for the bomb that hit the World Trade Center in 1993 and then flew straight to Iraq after the FBI so incautiously granted him bail. Iraq was then a country that was as difficult to enter as it was hard to leave. This thieves' kitchen dimension of a country run by criminals and sadists was not confined to the drugs and thugs, corruption and terrorism side. And once again, I was to pick up the spoor of an old connection. Rolf Akios came round to my apartment one day and showed me the name of the Iraqi diplomat who had visited the little West African country of Niger, a statelet famous only for its production of yellow cake uranium. The name was Wissam Zahawi. He was the brother of my louche, gay, part Kurdish friend, the by now late Mazen. He was also, or had been at the time of his trip to Niger, Saddam Hussein's ambassador to the Vatican, I expressed incomprehension. What was an envoy to the Holy See doing in Niger? Obviously he was not taking a vacation. Rolf then explained two things to me. The first was that Wissam Zahawi had, when Rolf was at the United Nations, been one of Saddam Hussein's chief envoys for discussions on nuclear matters, this at a time when the Iraqis had functioning reactors. The second was that during the period of sanctions that followed the Kuwait War, no Western European country had full diplomatic relations with Baghdad. The Vatican was the sole exception, so it was sent a very senior Iraqi envoy to act as a listening post. And this man, a specialist in nuclear matters, had made a discreet side trip to Niger. This was to suggest exactly what most right-thinking people were convinced was not the case, namely that British intelligence was onto something when it said that Saddam had not ceased seeking nuclear materials in Africa. This verifiable account is often confused with a bungled attempt to sell some forged documents from the embassy of Niger in Rome, a false trail that, whether out of cupidity or design, wasted the time of several already time-wasting inquiries. I published a few columns on this, drawing at one point an angry email from Ambassador Zahawi that very satisfyingly blustered and bluffed on what he'd really been up to. I also received, this is what sometimes makes journalism worthwhile, a letter from a BBC correspondent named Gordon Correa, who had been writing a book about A.Q. Khan. This was the Pakistani proprietor of the nuclear black market that had supplied fissile material to Libya, North Korea, very probably to Syria, and was open for business with any member of the Rogue States Club. Saddam's people, we already knew for sure, had been meeting North Korean missile salesmen in Damascus until just before the invasion, when Kim Jong-il's mercenary bargainers took fright and went home. It turned out, said the highly interested Mr. Correa, that his man Khan had also been in Niger, and at about the same time that Zahawi had. The likelihood of the senior Iraqi diplomat in Europe and the senior Pakistani nuclear black marketeer both choosing an off-season holiday in chic little uranium-rich Niger, well, you have to admit that it makes an affecting picture. But you must be ready to credit something as ridiculous as that, if your touching belief is that Saddam Hussein was already contained and that Mr. Bush and Mr. Blair were acting on panic reports, fabricated in turn by self-interested provocateurs. So I am proud of what our little international of volunteers was able to manage in this element of the crisis too. It can be just as useful to expose the laughable as it is important to unmask the hateful, as I had slowly discovered in those riverside Thames to Tigris moments, covering as they did the waterfront from Adolf Hitler through Agatha Christie to Oscar Wilde. Postscript. I was having an oppressively normal morning at the dawn of 2007, flicking through the banality of quotidian email traffic when I idly clicked on a message from a friend headed, "Seen this?" The attached item turned out to be a very well-written story by Teresa Watanabe of the Los Angeles Times. It described the death in Mosul, Iraq, of a young soldier from Irvine, California, named Mark Jennings Daly, and the unusual degree of emotion that his community was undergoing as a consequence. The emotion derived from a very moving statement that the boy had left behind, stating his reasons for having become a volunteer and bravely facing the prospect that his words might have to be read posthumously. In a way, the story was almost too perfect. This handsome lad had been born on the 4th of July, was a registered Democrat and self-described agnostic, a UCLA honors graduate, and during his college days had had fairly decided reservations about the war in Iraq. I read on, and actually printed the story out, and was turning a page when I saw the following. Somewhere along the way, he changed his mind. His family says there was no epiphany. Writings by author and columnist Christopher Hitchens on the moral case for war deeply influenced him. I don't exaggerate by much when I say that I froze. I certainly felt a very deep pang of cold dismay. I had just returned from a visit to Iraq with my own son, who was then 23, as was young Mr. Daly, and had found myself in a deeply pessimistic frame of mind about the war. Was it possible that I had helped persuade someone I'd never met to place himself in the path of an IED? Over-dramatizing myself a bit in the angst of the moment, I found I was thinking of William Butler Yeats, who was chilled to discover that the Irish rebels of 1916 had gone to their deaths, quoting his play Kathleen na Húlhan. He tried to cope with the disturbing idea in his poem Man and the Echo. Did that play of mine send out certain men the English shot? Could my spoken words have checked that whereby a house lay wrecked? Abruptly dismissing any comparison between myself and one of the greatest poets of the 20th century, I feverishly clicked on all the links from the article and found myself on Lieutenant Daly's MySpace site, where his statement, "Why I Joined," was posted. The site also immediately kicked into a skirling Irish noise of revolutionary Irish pugnacity, a song from the Dropkick Murphys album Warrior's Code. And there at the top of the page was a link to a passage from one of my articles, in which I poured scorn on those who were neutral about the battle for Iraq. I don't remember ever feeling, in every allowable sense of the word, quite so hollow. I writhed around in my chair for a bit and decided that I ought to call Ms. Watanabe, who could not have been nicer. She anticipated the question I was too tongue-tied to ask. Would the Daly family, those whose house lay wrecked, be contactable? They'd actually like to hear from you. She kindly gave me the email address and the home number. I don't intend to make a parade of my own feelings here, but I expect you will believe me when I tell you that I emailed first. For one thing, I didn't want to choose a bad time to ring. For another, and as I wrote to his parents, I was quite prepared for them to resent me. So let me introduce you to one of the most generous and decent families in the United States, and allow me to tell you something of their experience. In the midst of their own grief to begin with, they took the trouble to try and make me feel better. I wasn't to worry about any guilt or responsibility. Their son had signed up with his eyes wide open, and had assured us that if he knew the possible outcome might be this, he would still go, rather than have the option of living to age 50 and never having served his country. Trust us when we tell you that he was quite convincing and persuasive on this point, so that by the end of the conversation we were practically packing his bags and waving him off. This made me relax fractionally, but then they went on to write, "Prior to his deployment, he told us he was going to try to contact you from Iraq. He had the idea of being a correspondent from the front lines through you, and wanted to get your opinion about his journalistic potential. He told us that he had tried to contact you from either Iraq or Kuwait. He thought maybe his email had not reached you." That was a gash in my hide, all right. I think of all the junk mail I read every day and then reflect that his precious one never got to me. Lieutenant Daly crossed from Kuwait to Iraq in November 2006, where he would be deployed with the C or Comanche Company of the 2nd Battalion of the 7th Cavalry Regiment, rather unpromisingly General Custer's old outfit, in Mosul. On the following 15th of January, he was on patrol and noticed that the Humvee in front of him was not properly up-armoured against IEDs. He insisted on changing places and taking a lead position in his own Humvee, and was shortly afterwards hit by an enormous buried mine that packed a charge of some 1,500 pounds of high explosive. Yes, that's right. He and the 3 other American soldiers and Iraqi interpreter who perished with him went to war with the army we had, as Donald Rumsfeld so carefully put it. It's some consolation to John and Linda Daly and to Mark's brother and 2 sisters, and to his widow, who had been married to him for just 18 months, to know that he couldn't have felt anything. Yet, what and how should we feel? People are not on their oath when speaking of the dead, but I have now talked to a good number of those who knew Mark Daly or were related to him, and it's clear that the country lost an exceptional young citizen, whom I shall always wish I had had the chance to meet. He seems to have passed every test of young manhood and to have been admired and loved and respected by old and young, male and female, family and friends. He could have had any career path he liked, and had won a George G. Marshall Award that led to an offer to teach at West Point. Why are we robbed of his contribution? As we got to know one another better, I sent the Daly family a moving statement made by the mother of Michael Kelly, my good friend and the editor-at-large of the Atlantic Monthly, who was killed near the Baghdad airport while embedded during the invasion of 2003. Margaret Kelly was highly stoic about her son's death, but I now think I committed an error of taste in showing this to the Dalys, who very gently responded that Michael had lived long enough to write books, have a career, become a father, and in general make his mark, while their son didn't live long enough to enjoy any of these opportunities. If you have tears, prepare to shed them now. In his brilliant book, What is History?, Professor E.H. Carr asked about ultimate causation. Take the case of a man who drinks a bit too much, gets behind the wheel of a car with defective brakes, drives it round a blind corner, and hits another man who's crossing the road to buy cigarettes. Who is the one responsible? The man who had one drink too many? the lax inspector of brakes, the local authorities who didn't straighten out a dangerous bend, or the smoker who chose to dash across the road to satisfy his bad habit. So, was Mark Daly killed by the Baathistan bin Ladenist riffraff who placed bombs where they will do the most harm? Or by the Rumsfeld Doctrine, which sent American soldiers to Iraq in insufficient numbers and with inadequate equipment? Or by the Bush administration, which thought Iraq would be easily pacified? Or by the previous Bush administration, which left Saddam Hussein in power in 1991 and fatally postponed the time of reckoning? These grand overarching questions cannot obscure, at least for me, the plain fact that Mark Daly felt himself to be morally committed. I discovered this in his life story and in his surviving writings. Again, not to romanticize him overmuch, but this is the boy who would not let others be bullied in school, who stuck up for his younger siblings, who was briefly a vegetarian and Green Party member because he couldn't stand cruelty to animals or to the environment, a student who loudly defended Native American rights and who challenged a MySpace neo-Nazi in an online debate in which the swastika-displaying antagonist finally admitted that he needed to rethink things. If I give the impression of a slight nerd here, I do an injustice. Everything that Mark wrote was imbued with a great spirit of humour and tough-mindedness. Here's an excerpt from his Why I Joined statement. Anyone who knew me before I joined knows that I'm quite aware and at times sympathetic to the arguments against the war in Iraq. If you think the only way a person could bring themselves to volunteer for this war is through sheer desperation or blind obedience, then consider me the exception, though there are countless like me. Consider that there are 19-year-old soldiers from the Midwest who have never touched a college campus or a protest, who've done more to uphold the universal legitimacy of representative government and individual rights by placing themselves between Iraqi voting lines and homicidal religious fanatics. And here's something from one of his last letters home. I was having a conversation with a Kurdish man in the city of Dahuk, by myself and completely safe, discussing whether or not the insurgents could be viewed as freedom fighters or misguided anti-capitalists. Shaking his head as I attempted to articulate what can only be described as pathetic apologetics, he cut me off and said, "The difference between insurgents and American soldiers is that they get paid to take life, to murder, and you get paid to save lives." He looked at me in such a way that made me feel like he was looking through me, into all the moral insecurity that living in a free nation will instill in you. He oversimplified the issue, or at least that is what college professors would accuse him of doing. In his other emails and letters home, which the Daly family very kindly showed me, he asked for extra care packages to share with local Iraqis and said, "I'm not sure if Irvine has a sister city, but I'm going to personally contact the mayor and ask him to extend his hand to Dohuk, which has been more than hospitable to this native son." I was wrenched yet again to discover that he had got this touching idea from an old article of mine, which had made a proposal for city twinning that went nowhere. In the last analysis, it was quite clear. Mark had made up his mind that the United States was a force for good in the world, and that it had a duty to the freedom of others. A video clip of which he was very proud has him being crowned by a circle of smiling Iraqi officers. I have a photograph of him standing bareheaded and contentedly smoking a cigar on a rooftop in Mosul. He doesn't look like an occupier at all. He looks like a staunch friend and defender. On the photograph is written, "We carry a new world in our hearts." In his last handwritten letter home, posted on the last day of 2006, Mark modestly told his father that he'd been chosen to lead a combat battalion after a grenade attack had killed one of its soldiers and left its leader too shaken to carry on. He had apparently sounded steady enough on the radio on earlier missions for him to be given a leadership position after only a short time in country. As he put it, "I am now happily doing what I was trained to do, and am fulfilling an obligation that has swelled inside me for years. I am deep in my element, and I am euphoric." He had no doubts at all about the value of his mission, and was the sort of natural soldier who makes the difference in any war. At the first chance I got, I invited his family for lunch in California. We ended up spending the entire day together. As soon as they arrived, I knew I had been wrong to be so nervous. They looked too good to be true, like a poster for the American way. John Daly is an aerospace project manager, and his wife Linda is an audiologist. Their older daughter Christine, eagerly awaiting her wedding, is a high school biology teacher, and the younger sister Nicole is in high school. Their son Eric is a bright junior at Berkeley with a very winning and ironic grin. And there was Mark's widow, an agonizingly beautiful girl named Snejina Janet Christopher, the daughter of political refugees from Bulgaria. Her first name can mean snowflake, and this was his name for her in the letters of fierce tenderness that he sent her from Iraq. These, with your permission, I will not share, except this. One thing I have learned about myself since I've been out here is that everything I professed to you about what I want for the world and what I'm willing to do to achieve it was true. My desire to save the world is really just an extension of trying to make a world fit for you. If that is all she has left, I hope you will agree that it isn't nothing. I had already guessed that this was no gung-ho Orange County Republican clan. It was pretty clear that they could have done without the war and would have been happier if their son had not gone anywhere near Iraq. Mr. Daly told me that as a young man he'd wondered about going to Canada if the Vietnam draft ever caught up with him. But they had been amazed by the warmth of their neighbours' response and by the solidarity of his former brothers in arms. 1,600 people had turned out for Mark's memorial service in Irvine. A sergeant's wife had written a letter to Linda and posted it on Janet's MySpace site on Mother's Day to tell her that her husband had been in this vehicle with which Mark had insisted on changing places. She had 7 children who would have lost their father if it had gone the other way, and she felt both awfully guilty and humbly grateful that her husband had been spared by Mark's heroism. Imagine yourself in that position if you can, and you will perhaps get a hint of the world in which the Dalys now live, a world that alternates very sharply and steeply between grief and pride. On a drive to Fort Knox, Kentucky, and again shortly before shipping out from Fort Bliss, Texas, Mark had told his father that he had 3 wishes in the event of his death. He wanted bagpipes played at the service and an Irish wake to follow it, and he wanted to be cremated, with the ashes strewn on the beach at Nesco in Oregon, the setting for his happiest memories of boyhood vacations. The first 2 of these conditions had already been fulfilled. The Dalys rather overwhelmed me by asking if I would join them for the 3rd one. So it was that in August I found myself on the dunes by an especially lovely and remote stretch of the Oregon coastline. The extended family was there, including both sets of grandparents, plus some college friends of Mark's and his best comrade from the army, an impressive South Dakotan named Matt Gross. As the sun began to sink on a day that had been devoted to reminiscence and moderate drinking, we took up the tattered stars and stripes that had flown outside the family home since Mark's deployment, and walked to his favourite spot to plant it. Everyone was supposed to say something, but when John Daly took the first scoop from the urn and spread the ashes on the breeze, there was something so unutterably final in the gesture that tears seemed as natural as breathing, and I wasn't at all sure that I could go through with it. My idea had been to quote from the last scene of Macbeth, which is the only passage I know that can hope to rise to such an occasion. The tyrant and usurper has been killed, but Ross has to tell old Seward that his boy has perished in the struggle. Your son, my lord, has paid a soldier's debt. He only lived but till he was a man, which no sooner had his prowess confirmed in the unshrinking station where he fought, but like a man he died. This being Shakespeare, the truly emotional and understated moment follows a beat or 2 later, when Ross adds, "Your cause of sorrow must not be measured by his worth, for then it hath no end." I became a trifle choked up after that, but everybody else also managed to speak, often reading poems of their own composition, and as the day ebbed in a blaze of glory over the ocean, I thought, well, here we are to perform the last honours for a warrior and hero, and there are no hysterical ululations, no shrieks for revenge, no insults hurled at the enemy, no firing into the air or bogus hysterics. Instead, an honest, brave, modest family is doing its private best. I hope no fanatical fool could ever mistake this for weakness. It is instead a very particular kind of strength. If America can spontaneously produce young men like Mark, and occasions like this, it has a real homeland security instead of a bureaucratic one. But Mark Daly wasn't yet finished with sending me messages from beyond the grave. He took a bag of books with him to Iraq, which included Thomas Paine's The Crisis, War and Peace, Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, so nobody's perfect, Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time, John McCain's Why Courage Matters, and George Orwell's Animal Farm in 1984. And a family friend of the Dalys, noticing my own book on Orwell on their shelf, had told them that his father, the Trotskyist militant Harry David Milton had been the American who rushed to Orwell's side after he'd been shot in the throat by a fascist sniper. This seemed to verge on the eerie. Orwell thought that the Spanish Civil War was a just war, but he also came to understand that it was a dirty war, where a decent cause was hijacked by goons and thugs, and where betrayal and squalor negated the courage and sacrifice of those who fought on principle. As one who had argued strongly for the liberation of Iraq, perhaps more strongly than I knew in this particular case, I'd grown coarsened and sickened by the degeneration of the struggle and the sordid news of corruption and brutality. Mark Daly told his father how dismayed he was by the appalling scenes at Abu Ghraib, and by the paltry politicians who squabble for presidents while lifeblood is spilled by young people whose boots they're not fit to clean. It upsets and angers me more than I can safely say when I reread Mark's letters and poems and see that, as of course he would, he was magically able to locate the noble element in all this, and to take more comfort and inspiration from a few plain sentences uttered by a Kurdish man than from all the vapid speeches ever given. Orwell had a rather similar experience when encountering a young volunteer fighter in Barcelona, and realizing, with a mixture of sadness and shock, that for this boy, all the tired old slogans of liberty and justice were still authentic. He cursed his own cynicism and disillusionment when he wrote, "For the fly-blown words that make me spew still in his ears were holy, and he was born knowing what I had learned out of books and slowly." However, after a few more verses about the lying and cruelty and stupidity that accompany war, he was still able to do a kind of justice to the brave young man. "But the thing I saw in your face, no power can disinherit, no bomb that ever burst shatters the crystal spirit." May it be so, then, and may death be not proud to have taken Mark Daly, whom I never knew, but whom you now know little, and, I hope, miss. Something of myself. Our wodsome power the gift gie us to see ourselves as others see us. That's Robert Burns. Many men would take the death sentence without a whimper to escape the life sentence which fate carries in her other hand. T.E. Lawrence. Plato says that the unexamined life is not worth living, but what if the examined life turns out to be a clunker as well? Kurt Vonnegut, Wampeter's Fommer and Granfluence. About once or twice every month, I engage in public debates with those whose pressing need it is to woo and win the approval of supernatural beings. Very often, when I give my view that there is no supernatural dimension, and certainly not one that is only or especially available to the faithful, and that the natural world is wonderful enough, and even miraculous enough, if you insist, I attract pitying looks and anxious questions. How, in that case, I am asked, do I find meaning and purpose in life? How does a mere and gross materialist with no expectation of a life to come decide what, if anything, is worth caring about? Depending on my mood, I sometimes, but not always, refrain from pointing out what a breathtakingly insulting and patronizing question this is. It's on a par with the equally subtle inquiry, since you don't believe in our God, what stops you from stealing and lying and raping and killing to your heart's content? Just as the answer to the latter question is self-respect and the desire for the respect of others, while in the meantime it is precisely those who think they have divine permission who are truly capable of any atrocity, so the answer to the first question falls into two parts. A life that partakes even a little of friendship, love, irony, humour, parenthood, literature, and music, and the chance to take part in battles for the liberation of others, cannot be called meaningless, except if the person living it is also an existentialist and elects to call it so. It could be that all existence is a pointless joke, but it is not in fact possible to live one's everyday life as if this were so. Whereas if one sought to define meaningless and futility, the idea that a human life should be expended in the guilty, fearful, self-obsessed propitiation of supernatural non-entities, but there, enough. The clear awareness of having been born into a losing struggle need not lead one into despair. I do not especially like the idea that one day I shall be tapped on the shoulder and informed, Not that the party is over, but that it is most assuredly going on, only henceforth in my absence. It's the second of those thoughts, the edition of the newspaper that will come out on the day after I've gone, that is the more distressing. Much more horrible, though, would be the announcement that the party was continuing forever, and that I was forbidden to leave. Whether it was a hellishly bad party, or a party that was perfectly heavenly in every respect, the moment that it became eternal and compulsory would be the precise moment that it began to pall. A memoir of the New School for Social Research, where I have the honour to be an occasional visiting teacher, describes how in the immediate post-1945 period, Erich Fromm gave a lecture on the struggle against pointlessness. I have never been able to trace even one paragraph of this talk, though I hunger to know what it said. Attending the lecture would have been many young men just out of uniform, coming to the school on the GI Bill and having just inflicted a defeat on the fascist Axis. They can hardly have considered that struggle to have been pointless. But then, what of the millions who died so horribly in Europe and Asia, and who died having barely lived? What was the point of them, except perhaps as ghastly illustrations of a wider point? Attempts to locate oneself within history are as natural and as absurd as attempts to locate oneself within astronomy. On the day that I was born, the 13th of April 1949, 19 senior Nazi officials were convicted at Nuremberg, including Hitler's former envoy to the Vatican, Baron Ernst von Weizsäcker, who was found guilty of planning aggression against Czechoslovakia and committing atrocities against the Jewish people. On the same day, the State of Israel celebrated its first Passover Seder, and the United Nations, still meeting in those days at Flushing Meadow in Queens, voted to consider the Jewish state's application for membership. In Damascus, 11 newspapers were closed by the regime of General Hosni Zaim. In America, the National Committee on Alcoholism announced an upcoming A Day under the non-uplifting slogan, "You can drink. Help the alcoholic who can't." Can't? The International Court of Justice at The Hague ruled in favour of Britain in the Corfu Channel dispute with Albania. At the UN, Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko denounced the newly formed NATO alliance as a tool for aggression against the USSR. The rising Chinese communists, under a man then known to Western readership as Mao Zedong, announced a limited willingness to bargain with the still existing Chinese government in a city then known to the outside world as Taiping. All this was unknown to me as I nuzzled my mother's breast for the first time, and would certainly have happened in just the same way if I had not been born at all, or even conceived. One of the newspaper astrologists for that day addressed those whose birthday it was. There are powerful rays from the planet Mars, the war god, in your horoscope for your coming year, and this always means a chance to battle if you want to take it up. Try to avoid such disturbances where women relatives or friends are concerned, because the outlook for victory upon your part in such circumstances is rather dark. If you must fight, pick a man. Sage counsel, no doubt, which I wish I had imbibed with that same maternal lactation, but impartially offered also to the many people born on that day who were also destined to die on it. I suppose that one reason I have always detested religion is its sly tendency to insinuate the idea that the universe is designed with you in mind, or, even worse, that there is a divine plan into which one fits whether one knows it or not. This kind of modesty is too arrogant for me. However, I have been unblushing enough to write a book that is largely about myself, and I thought it might be of interest if I said a few words about what I am actually like. In this I'm going by what I often feel, as a reviewer, is missing in standard works of memoir and autobiography. Here's one way to start. Every month, my lustrous colleagues at Vanity Fair select a personality and subject him or her to what is known as the Proust questionnaire. The great Marcel did not actually devise this form of self-interrogation, but on 2 occasions in his life he was seduced into answering one. I have here amalgamated the 2 sets of questions. What do you regard as the lowest depth of misery? Just to give you an idea, Proust's reply was, to be separated from Mama. I think that the lowest depth of misery ought to be distinguished from the highest pitch of anguish. In the lower depths come enforced idleness, sexual boredom and or impotence. At the highest pitch, the death of a friend, or even the fear of the death of a child. Where would you like to live? In a state of conflict or a conflicted state? What is your idea of earthly happiness? To be vindicated in my own lifetime. To what faults do you feel most indulgent? To the ones that arise from urgent material needs. Who are your favourite heroes of fiction? Dennis Barlow, Humbert Humbert, Horatio Hornblower, Jeeves, Nicholas Salmanovich Rubashov, Funish the Memorious, Lucifer. Who are your favourite characters in history? Socrates, Spinoza, Thomas Paine, Rosa Luxemburg, Leon Trotsky. Who are your favourite heroines in real life? The women of Afghanistan, Iraq and Iran, who risked their lives and their beauty to defy the foulness of theocracy. Ayan Hashi Ali and Azan Hafizi as their ideal feminine model. Who are your favourite heroines of fiction? Maggie Tulliver, Dorothea, Becky Sharp, Candy, O, Bertie's Aunt Dahlia. Your favourite painter? Goya, Otto Dix. Your favourite musician? J.S. Bach, Bob Dylan. The quality you most admire in a man? Courage, moral and physical. Anima, the ability to think like a woman. Also a sense of the absurd. The quality you most admire in a woman? Courage, moral and physical. Anima, the ability to visualize the mind and need of a man. Also a sense of the absurd. Your favourite virtue? An appreciation for irony. Your least favourite virtue, or nominee for the most overrated one? Faith, closely followed, in view of the overall shortage of time, by patience. Your proudest achievement? Since I can't claim the children as solely mine, being the dedicatee of books by Salman Rushdie and Martin Amis and poems by James Fenton and Robert Conquest. Your favourite occupation? Travel in contested territory, hard-working, writing and reading when safely home, in the knowledge that an amusing friend is later coming to dinner. Who would you have liked to be? Prometheus, Oscar Wilde, Émile Zola. Your most marked characteristic? Insecurity. What do you most value in your friends? Their continued existence. What is your principal defect? Becoming bored too easily. What to your mind would be the greatest of misfortunes? Loss of memory. What would you like to be? One who understood music and chess and mathematics, or one who had the courage to bear arms? What is your favourite colour? Blue, sometimes red. What is your favourite flower? Garlic. What is your favourite bird? The owl. What word or expression do you most overuse? Rereading a collection of my stuff, I was rather startled to find that it was perhaps. Who are your favourite poets? Philip Larkin, Robert Conquest, W. H. Auden, James Fenton, W. B. Yeats, Chidiock Titchbourne, G. K. Chesterton, Wendy Cope. What are your favourite names? Alexander, Sophia, Antonia, Celeste, Liam, Hannah, Elizabeth, Wolfgang. What is it you most dislike? Stupidity, especially in its nastiest forms of racism and superstition. Which historical figures do you most despise? Stanley Baldwin, the Ayatollah Khomeini. Which contemporary figures do you most despise? Henry Kissinger, Osama bin Laden, Joseph Ratzinger. Which events in military history do you most admire? Thermopylae, Lepanto, the defence of Little Round Top at Gettysburg, the mutinies in the German army in 1918 and the German General Staff in 1944, the Royal Navy's Arctic convoys. Which natural gift would you most like to possess? The ability to master other languages, which would have hugely enhanced the scope of these answers. How would you like to die? Fully conscious, and either fighting or reciting, or fooling around. What do you most dislike about your appearance? The way in which it makes former admirers search for neutral words. What is your motto? Allons travailler. This more imperative version of get on with it is annexed from Émile Zola, though E.M. Forster somewhat overextended it by enjoining us to get on with your own work and behave as if you were immortal. Though this is only a party game, which is the form in which Proust was twice persuaded to play it, it can be revealing. Reviewing my own answers, I, at any rate, can see where I give away more of myself than might be obvious. Take the answer to the question about the principal defect. I used also to play the game of, if you were an animal, what animal would you be? When others chose for me, I was quite frequently a fox. Lately, however, there have been quite a few nominations of badger. This is not merely a question of my becoming stouter and more grizzled. It is the downside of what I consider one of my happier skills as well. In other words, I would often rather have an argument or a quarrel than be bored. And, because I hate to lose an argument, I am often willing to protract one for its own sake rather than concede even a small point. Plainly, this unwillingness to give ground, even on unimportant disagreements, is the symptom of some deep-seated insecurity, as was my one-time fondness for making teasing remarks, which I amended when I read Anthony Pole's matter-of-fact observation that teasing is an unfailing sign of misery within, and as is my very pronounced impatience. The struggle, therefore, is to try and cultivate the virtuous side of these shortcomings, to be a genial host while only slightly whiffled, for example, or to be witty at the expense of one's own weaknesses instead of those of other people. I am often described to my irritation as a contrarian, and even had the title inflicted on me by the publisher of one of my early books. At least on that occasion, I lived up to the title by ridiculing the word in my introduction to the book's first chapter. It's actually a pity that our culture doesn't have a good vernacular word for an oppositionist or even for someone who tries to do his own thinking. The word dissident can't be self-conferred because it is really a title of honour that has to be won or earned, while terms like gadfly or maverick are somehow trivial and condescending as well as overfull of self-regard. And I've lost count of the number of memoirs by old comrades or ex-comrades that have titles like Against the Stream, Against the Current, Minority of One, Breaking Ranks, and so forth, all of them lending point to Isaac Rosenberg's withering remark about the herd of independent minds. Even when I was quite young, I disliked being called a rebel. It seemed to make the patronizing suggestion that questioning authority was part of a phase through which I would naturally go. On the contrary, I was a relatively well-behaved and well-mannered boy, and chose my battles with some deliberation rather than just thinking with my hormones. I am fairly proud, therefore, that my better and longer meditated quarrels have won me at least some respect that I could have forfeited if I had missed, as the French so quenchingly say, a perfectly good opportunity of keeping my mouth shut. After years of pursuing Henry Kissinger with allegations, liar, murderer, war criminal, pseudo-academic, bore, that made many observers say in print that if he had any balls at all he'd have to sue me, he instead lost his composure and made some hysterically slanderous counter-allegations, which ended up with his lawyers withdrawing rather than mine. That was well worth the time it took me. During the 1992 election, I concluded as early as my first visit to New Hampshire that Bill Clinton was hateful in his behavior to women, pathological as a liar, and deeply suspect when it came to money in politics. I've never had to take any of that back, whereas if you look up what most of my profession was then writing about the beefy, unscrupulous New Democrat, you will be astonished at the quantity of sheer saccharine and drool. Anyway, I kept on about it even after most Republicans had consulted the opinion polls and decided that it was a losing proposition. And if you look up the transcript of the eventual Senate trial of the president, only the second impeachment hearing in American history, you will see that the last order of business is a request, voted down, by the Senate Majority Leader to call Carol and me as witnesses. So I can dare to say that at least I saw it through. When the late Pope John Paul II decided to place the woman so strangely known as Mother Teresa on the fast track for beatification, and thus to qualify her for eventual sainthood, the Vatican felt obliged to solicit my testimony, and I thus spent several hours in a closed hearing room with a priest, a deacon, and a Monsignor, no doubt making their day, as I told off, as from a rosary, the frightful faults and crimes of the departed fanatic. In the course of this, I discovered that the Pope, during his tenure, had surreptitiously abolished the famous office of devil's advocate in order to fast-track still more of his many candidates for canonization. I can thus claim to be the only living person to have represented the devil pro bono. Very often, the test of one's allegiance to a cause or to a people is precisely the willingness to stay the course when things are boring, to run the risk of repeating an old argument just one more time, or of going one more round with a hostile, or much worse, an indifferent audience. I first became involved with the Czech opposition in 1968 when it was an intoxicating and celebrated cause. Then, during the depressing 1970s and 1980s, I was a member of a routine committee that tried, with limited success, to help the reduced forces of Czech descent to stay nourished and published. The most pregnant moment of that commitment was one that I managed to miss at the time. I passed an afternoon with Zdeněk Mlynář, exiled former secretary of the Czech Communist Party, who in the bleak early 1950s in Moscow had formed a friendship with a young Russian militant with an evident sense of irony named Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev. In 1988 I was arrested in Prague for attending a meeting of one of Václav Havel's Charter 77 committees. That outwardly exciting experience was interesting precisely because of its almost Zen-like tedium. I had gone to Prague, determined to be the first visiting writer, not to make use of the name Franz Kafka. But the numbing bureaucracy got the better of me. When I asked why I was being detained, I was told that I had no need to know the reason. Totalitarianism is itself a cliché, as well as a tundra of pulverizing boredom, and it forced the cliché upon me in turn. I did have to mention Kafka in my eventual story. The regime fell not very much later, as I had slightly foreseen in that same piece that it would. I'd happened to notice that the young Czechs arrested with us were not at all frightened by the police, as their older mentors had been and still were, and also that the police themselves were almost fatigued by their job. This was totalitarianism practically yawning itself to death. In the report of our arrest in the Prague communist paper Rude Pravo, another production that if read aloud could cause flying creatures to fall stunned from the sky, it was rightly reported that some of the suspicious foreigners detained were thought to be sympathizers with Leon Trotsky. As a sort of editorial nudge to keep the prejudices of the readers awake, as well as the readers themselves, there followed a parenthesis explaining that Trotsky was a pseudonym for Bronstein. Every little bit helps, or so the crack editorial team must have thought. A couple of years after that, I was overcome to be invited to an official reception in Prague to thank those who had been consistent friends through the stultifying years of what the party had so perfectly termed normalization. As with my tiny moment with Nelson Mandela, a whole historic stretch of nothingness and depression, combined with the long and deep insult of having to be pushed around by boring and mediocre people, could be at least partially cancelled and annealed by one flash of humour and charm and generosity. That's what I meant by my vindication answer a few paragraphs further back. I therefore am glad that I waited as long as I did before ingesting and digesting Marcel Proust, because one has to have endured a few decades before wanting, let alone needing, to embark on the project of recovering lost life. And I think it may be possible to review the chronicles of wasted time. William Morris wrote in The Dream of John Ball that men fight for things and then lose the battle, only to win it again in a shape and form that they had not expected, and then be compelled again to defend it under another name. We are all of us very good at self-persuasion, and I strive to be alert to its traps, but a version of what Hegel called the cunning of history is a parallel commentary that I fight to keep alive in my mind. My deep vice of lack of patience had its worst outcome, I feel sure, in the raising of my children. Many men feel somewhat useless during the early childhood of their offspring, as well as paralyzed with admiration for the way that women seem somehow to know what to do when the babies arrive. I don't think I can take refuge in the general weakness of my sex. Confronted with infancy, I was exceptionally no good. Anything I don't say here is only intended to spare others, not myself. Like not a few men, I set myself to overcompensate by working ever harder, which I think has its own justification in the biologically essential task of feeding and clothing and educating one's young. But I was really marking time until they were old enough to be able to hold a conversation. And I have to face the fact that the children of both my marriages learned much, much more about manhood and nurturing from their grandparents, my magnificent in-laws, than they did from me. That is one lapse, and not just a lapse in time, that I know I shall not make up for. One cannot invent memories for other people, and the father figure for my children must be indistinct at best until quite late in their lives. There are days when this gives me inexpressible pain, and I know that such days of remorse also lie in my future. I distinguish remorse from regret, in that remorse is sorrow for what one did do, whereas regret is misery for what one did not do. Both seem to be involved in this case. The only recourse, my own promise and vow, was and is to get a bit better as they get older, hence this example, which I hope I'll be able to improve upon before they come and screw down the lid, or whatever it is. As he grew older, which was mostly in my absence, my firstborn son Alexander became ever more humorous and courageous. There came a time, as the confrontation with the enemies of our civilization became more acute, when he sent off various applications to enlist in the armed forces. I didn't want to be involved in this decision either way, especially since I was being regularly taunted for not having sent any of my children to fight in the wars of resistance that I supported. As if I could send anybody, let alone a grown-up and tough and smart young man. What moral imbeciles the anti-war people have become. Anyway, sometime late in 2007, I felt it was time that I myself went back to Iraq and asked Alexander if he'd like to come along. The plan was to limit the visit to the Kurdish north, which, as I told his mother, was reasonably safe. When we disembarked on free soil at Erbil Airport, there was a group of Kurds waiting to greet me as a friend and ally, and I felt at that moment as if my boy might feel that his old father had not been entirely a jerk. The sequel, which I cannot not tell, was this. We received an invitation to come down to Baghdad, which was in those awful days considered to be lethally unsafe, even in the green zone. I told Alexander that it was his decision to make, and that nobody would think any the less of him for declining. He very coolly replied, "But let's go." And so we did. I tried not to show how proud I was, which I now think was a mistake. To be the father of growing daughters is to understand something of what Yeats evokes with his imperishable phrase, terrible beauty. Nothing can make one so happily exhilarated or so frightened. It's a solid lesson in the limitations of self to realize that your heart is running around inside someone else's body. It also makes me quite astonishingly calm at the thought of death. I know who I would die to protect, and I also understand that nobody but a lugubrious serf can possibly wish for a father who never goes away. Many writers, especially male ones, have told us that it is the decease of the father which opens the prospect of one's own end, and affords an unobstructed view of the undug but awaiting grave that says, "You're next." Unfilial as this may seem, that was not at all so in my own case. It was only when I watched Alexander being born that I knew at once that my own funeral director had very suddenly, but quite unmistakably, stepped onto the stage. I was surprised by how calmly I took this, but also by how reluctant I was to mention it to my male contemporaries. That changed only when one of these, my friend Haim Tannenbaum, invited me home to view his own first son, Moses. "You haven't met the Kaddish," was his unforgettable way of phrasing the invitation. This was also when I appreciated the entire implication of the poem that Jorge Luis Borges had given me. Incidentally, I've also learned a bit about the importance of avoiding feminine embarrassment. "Daddy," wrote Sophia when she enrolled at the new school where I teach, "people will ask, why is old Christopher Hitchens kissing that girl?" And shall now cease and desist. In his Minima Moralia, Theodore Adorno made a beautiful corkscrew or double helix-shaped aphorism about the Hayes Office, which was then the headquarters of moralistic and ideological invigilation of the movie industry. Under its unsmiling rules, no double beds could be shown, no race mixing, no untoward conduct, or risque speech. Nonetheless, ventured Adorno, an intellectually and aesthetically satisfying film could be made, observing all the limitations prescribed by the Hayes Office, on the sole condition that there was no Hayes Office. When I first came across this morsel of condensed reflection, I realized what a large role it had already played in my own life. "Let's just go in and enjoy ourselves," Yvonne had said, after a long moment when the Hitchens family had silently reviewed the menu, actually of the prices, not the courses, outside a restaurant on our first and only visit to Paris. I knew at once that the odds against enjoyment had shortened, or as it lengthened, I never remember. "You should be nicer to him," a schoolmate had once said to me of some awfully ill-favoured boy. "He has no friends." This, I realized with a pang of pity that I can still remember, was only true as long as everybody agreed to it. There are more robust versions of the same contradiction. A plug-ugly Labour Union Cosa Nostra figure, asked at a Senate hearing if he thought his outfit was too powerful, looked around a couple of times and leaned into the mic before saying, "Senator, being powerful's a bit like being ladylike. If you have to say you are, then you probably ain't." British diplomats and Anglo-American types in Washington have a near-superstitious prohibition on uttering the words "special relationship" to describe relations between Britain and America, lest the specialness itself vanish like a phantom at cockcrow. Never ask while you are doing it if what you are doing is fun. Don't introduce even your most reliably witty acquaintance as someone who will set the table on a roar. "Martin's your best friend, isn't he?" a sweet and well-intentioned girl once said when both of us were present. It was the only time I ever felt awkward about this precious idea, which seemed somehow to risk diminishment if it were uttered aloud. The fragility of love is what is most at stake here. Humanity's most crucial three-word avowal is often uttered only to find itself suddenly embarrassing or orphaned or isolated or ill-timed. But strangely enough, it can work better as a literal or reassuring statement than as a transcendent or numinous or ecstatic one. Ian McEwan wrote a morally faultless essay just after the atrocities of the 11th of September 2001, noting that almost all voicemail messages from those on the doomed aircraft had ended with this very common trinity of words, and adding, in an almost but not quite supererogatory fashion, that by this means the murder victims had outdone and outlived their butchers. But for me this Hayes Office problem complicates the ancient question that Bertrand Russell answered, to my immense surprise, in the affirmative. If you were offered the chance to live your own life again, would you seize the opportunity? The only real philosophical answer is automatically self-contradictory. Only if I did not know that I was doing so. To go through the entire experience once more would be banal and Sisyphean, even if it did build muscle, whereas to wish to be young again and to have the benefit of one's learned and acquired existence is not at all to wish for a repeat performance or a Groundhog Day. And the mind ought to, but cannot, set some limits to wish-thinking. All right, same me, but with more money, an even sturdier penis, slightly different parents, briefer latency period. The thing's absurd. I seriously would like to know what it was to be a woman, but like blind Tiresias would also want the option of re-metamorphosing if I wished. How terrible it is that we have so many more desires than opportunities. So I wouldn't be Hitch again, whatever the inducement, nor would I have carried my green card in my wallet, as I loyally did every day for more than 2 decades, because I respected the law that said I should, if my adopted country had in fact subjected me to random stops and searches for it. Even if it were possible to cast my horoscope in this one life, and to make an accurate prediction about my future, it would not be possible to show it to me, because as soon as I saw it, my future would change by definition. This is why Werner Heisenberg's adaptation of the Hayes Office, the so-called principle of uncertainty, whereby the act of measuring something has the effect of altering the measurement, is of such importance. In my case, the difference is often made by publicity. For example, and to boast of one of my few virtues, I used to derive pleasure from giving my time to bright young people who showed promise as writers, and who asked for my help. Then some profile of me quoted someone who disclosed that I liked to do this. Then it became something widely said of me, whereupon it became almost impossible for me to go on doing it, because I started to receive far more requests than I could respond to, let alone satisfy. Perception modifies reality. When I abandoned the smoking habit of more than 3 decades, I was given a supposedly helpful pill called Wellbutrin. But as soon as I discovered that this was the brand name for an antidepressant, I tossed the bottle away. There may be successful methods for overcoming the blues, but for me they cannot include a capsule that says, "Fool yourself into happiness while pretending not to do so." I should actually want my mind to be strong enough to circumvent such a trick. I try to deny myself any illusions or delusions, and I think that this perhaps entitles me to try and deny the same to others, at least as long as they refuse to keep their fantasies to themselves. Karl Marx phrased this most perfectly by saying that critics should pluck the flowers from the chain, not so that men may wear the chain without consolation, but so that they may break the chain and cull the living flower. So I was a touch appalled, as I once did hear Ronald Dworkin drawlingly say, when I read the following in the memoir of my beloved friend Christopher Buckley. It's drawn from a speech that was delivered at his father's funeral. "We must do what we can to bring hammer blows against the bell jar that protects the dreamers from reality. The ideal scenario is that pounding from without we can effect resonances which will one day crack through to the latent impulses of those who dream within, bringing to life a circuit that will spare the Republic." There's a bit of metaphor mixture there and an odd recurrence of that same bell jar that has shadowed me for so long, but I was beginning to swell with admiration for it until I noticed that it was a Buckleyism being cited by Henry Kissinger, during whose speech at the memorial I had stepped out into the rain-swept street rather than be counted as among his audience. Hardest of all, as one becomes older, is to accept that sapient remarks can be drawn from the most unwelcome or seemingly improbable sources, and that the apparently more trustworthy sources can lead one astray. Gore Vidal, for instance, once languidly told me that one should never miss a chance, either to have sex or to appear on television. My efforts to live up to this maxim have mainly resulted in my passing many unglamorous hours on off-peak cable TV. It was actually Vidal's great foe, William F. Buckley, who launched my part-time television career by inviting me onto firing line when I was still quite young, and giving me one of the American right's less towering intellects as my foil. The response to the show made my day, and then my week, yet almost every time I go to a TV studio, I feel faintly guilty. This is preeminently the soft world of dream and illusion and perception. It has only a surrogate relationship to the hard world of printed words and written-down concepts, to which I've tried to dedicate my life, and that surrogate relationship, while it too may be verbal, consists of being glib rather than fluent, fast rather than quick, sharp rather than pointed. It means reveling in the fact that I have a meretricious want-it-both-ways side. My only excuse is to say, at least I do not pretend that this is not so.